The bus screeched to a halt at the edge of the Naval Special Warfare Training Center. The candidates stepped down one by one, shoulders broad, eyes sharp, jaws clenched with determination. They were men who had spent months, some years, preparing for this very moment. Their gazes swept across the compound where countless legends had been forged and broken. This was the crucible of Navy SEAL training, where the weak were crushed and the strong were refined into weapons of war. And then she stepped off the bus. For a moment, the world seemed to pause. Boots hit the ground, gravel crunched, and eyes darted toward her like magnets. She was the anomaly, the unexpected piece in a puzzle designed for uniformity. Her frame was lean, her stride steady, her face unreadable. She carried the same gear, wore the same uniform, and walked the same line, but to many of the men standing nearby, she didn't belong. Whispers spread fast, slipping between clenched teeth and tight-lipped smirks. Is she serious? She won't last a week. Bet she rings the bell before Friday. The bell, that dreaded brass instrument, hanging near the training compound, was a constant reminder of failure. A single strike meant quitting. The instructors didn't need to break the candidates. The candidates often broke themselves. Out of every 100 who walked through those gates, only a handful emerged on the other side. And now, all eyes seemed convinced that she would be the first to fall. She heard the whispers, though she gave no sign. Her face remained composed, her gaze fixed ahead as if the chatter around her were nothing but the buzzing of flies. But deep inside, she stored every word, every smirk, every dismissive glance. They weren't insults, they were fuel. The instructors barked their orders, dragging the candidates into line. The atmosphere shifted instantly. It no longer mattered who was skeptical and who wasn't. The only thing that mattered was obedience. The instructors were wolves, circling their prey with eyes that could slice through steel. They thrived on chaos, on breaking down every shred of pride, and on rebuilding men, or in this case, one woman into something unrecognizable. Drop, an instructor roared. Dozens of bodies hit the ground in unison. The sand was rough, biting into palms and knees as the first round of push-ups began. Shouts echoed through the compound, a symphony of exertion and pain. She moved with the group, her form precise, her rhythm steady. Sweat beaded on foreheads within minutes, yet she refused to slow. It didn't take long before some of the men started sneaking glances. They had expected her to falter quickly, maybe even collapse. Instead, she pressed on with the calm intensity of someone who had been here before, though none of them knew she hadn't. What she lacked in size, she compensated with an almost unnerving level of focus. The instructors noticed. They always noticed. But they said nothing. They weren't interested in proving her weak. They wanted to see if she could survive the storm on her own. By the end of the first day, the group was exhausted. Muscles screamed, lungs burned, and blisters formed in places most men hadn't thought possible. The sun had beaten down mercilessly, and the sand clung to every inch of skin, like grit meant to remind them of their insignificance. Some candidates already looked broken, eyes darting toward the bell in guilty desperation. But not her. She sat silently on the edge of her bunk, rolling her shoulders and stretching her arms, as if preparing herself for what was to come. Around her, the whispers resumed. She won't last another day. She's just stubborn. She's slowing us down. None of it touched her. She had spent years preparing for this moment, years of training her body until it refused to break, training her mind until doubt had no home. She hadn't come here to prove anything to them. She had come here because this was the path she had chosen, and nothing, not whispers, not doubt, not pain, was going to push her off it. The following morning was colder. The candidates were driven into the Pacific, waves crashing around them, the freezing water gnawing at every nerve. Teeth chattered, body shivered uncontrollably, and still, the instructors demanded they link arms and sing. The cold wasn't meant to freeze them, it was meant to fracture their unity. Again, eyes turned toward her. Surely this would be her breaking point. Surely the freezing water would tear down whatever resolve she had. But there she was, locked arm in arm with the others, voice steady in song, even as her lips turned blue. She didn't resist the pain, she accepted it. She let it wash over her, let it sink into her bones, and still she refused to quit. The instructors barked again, dragging them onto the sand for sugar cookies, rolling in the wet sand until every inch of skin was coated, the cold biting harder now that their bodies were drenched. She rolled with the rest, sand grinding into her eyes, her mouth, her hair. When she stood, she was unrecognizable, just another silhouette among the many. And maybe, just maybe, that was her greatest weapon. She didn't need to stand out. She needed to endure. That night, as the candidates collapsed into their bunks, some already nursing injuries and second thoughts, she remained awake. She lay still, listening to the steady rhythm of breathing around her, to the faint creak of the building, to the silence that followed a day designed to destroy. She thought of her father, who had once told her, "Strength isn't about shouting louder than others. It's about standing when everyone else has fallen." And that was exactly what she intended to do. The days blurred together in a haze of exhaustion and grit. Every morning was another war against her own limits. Every night a battle against the doubts gnawing at the edges of her mind. Yet she endured. Each time the instructors tried to break them, she rebuilt herself stronger. Each time her peers whispered of her failure, she pushed harder. Soon, something unexpected began to happen. The whispers started to fade. They weren't replaced by cheers, nor by camaraderie, but by silence. A silence born of unease. They couldn't explain how she was still there, how she had outlasted those who had mocked her most fiercely. Men bigger, stronger, louder than her were gone, their names erased by the ringing of the bell. But she remained. The outsider had survived her first crucible. And deep inside, where no one could see, she knew this was only the beginning. The first week of training had stripped away more than sweat. It had already taken men who had arrived boasting of strength and ground them into silence. The bell had rung 3 times, each clang echoing like a funeral toll across the compound. Each man who rang it walked away with his head down, his dream ending with a shiver in the cold morning air. But she was still there, and that fact alone gnawed at the pride of some of the others. At first, their resistance had been subtle. A pack mentality had formed early among the men, the type of unspoken brotherhood built on tradition, testosterone, and defiance. She was the interruption, a single note out of key in a symphony that demanded uniformity. Her very presence challenged what they believed this place was supposed to be. So they decided to make her feel it. During gear inspections, her rucksack mysteriously gained extra weight. Where she shouldered 50 pounds, she found herself hauling 60. When the team ran the obstacle course, a stray shove on the ladder slowed her progress, masked as clumsiness. And during long-distance runs across the sand, when the instructors weren't watching, some fell back to box her in, closing the path ahead, forcing her into a struggle just to keep pace. To anyone else, it would have felt like sabotage. To her, it felt like war. She noticed every detail, the way hands accidentally brushed her pack to slip in rocks, the glances exchanged before someone tripped near her during sprints, the deliberate crowding of her path. They wanted her to stumble, to falter in front of the instructors, to be branded as dead weight. But instead of breaking, she adjusted. She learned to rebalance her pack when it grew heavier, shifting her stride so it didn't slow her down. She practiced weaving through tight clusters of runners, moving as fluidly as water slipping between stones. Every dirty trick sharpened her instincts. Every unfair challenge forged her mind. If they wanted to box her in, she would find cracks in their walls. If they wanted to weigh her down, she would grow strong enough to carry it. And silently, she stored everything. Not with bitterness, but with patience. One night, as they collapsed into their bunks, after a day that had started before sunrise and stretched past midnight, she overheard them laughing. The dormitory was dim, the air thick with the smell of sweat and salt from the sea. Their voices were low, but not low enough to escape her ears. "She's slowing us down. Every time she falls behind, we all pay for it. She won't last another week. Let her ring out and be done with it." She lay motionless in her bunk, eyes open to the shadows overhead. They thought she didn't hear. They thought their whispers disappeared into the night. But she caught every word, and instead of anger, she felt something colder settle in her chest. They wanted her gone, because her presence revealed their weakness. If she could survive what they were struggling with, what did that say about them? The next morning, the instructors ordered a log PT session. Each team was handed a massive wooden log, long enough to stretch across 6 shoulders, heavy enough to grind bones and bruise skin. Together, they were expected to hoist it, run with it, press it overhead in unison. Teamwork was the core of the drill, and failure by one meant punishment for all. This was their chance. As the log hit their shoulders, she felt it almost immediately, the uneven weight. 2 men on her side loosened their grips, just enough that the burden shifted toward her. Her muscles screamed under the imbalance, and every step threatened to grind her into the sand. It wasn't an accident. They wanted her crushed under the log, wanted the instructors to see her fail the team. Her jaw clenched, and she pushed harder. Sweat rolled down her face, her boots sank deeper into the sand, and her shoulders burned like fire. But she refused to bend. Inch by inch, step by step, she kept the log moving, her body trembling with the effort. The instructors barked commands, eyes hawk-sharp. If they noticed the imbalance, they didn't intervene. This was part of the test, not just of strength, but of unity. Finally, one of the men sneered, his voice low so only she could hear. "You're going to break." She didn't answer. She didn't need to. Her silence was its own weapon, sharper than any retort. When the exercise ended, several of them collapsed to their knees, groaning in exhaustion. She lowered the log slowly, refusing to show them the tremor in her arms. And then, without a word, she stepped back in line, her face calm, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. That silence unnerved them more than any outburst could have. Over the following days, their efforts escalated. Sand poured into her boots, slowing her runs. Her canteen went missing before a long march, leaving her parched under the relentless sun. Even her bunk was tampered with, blankets soaked in seawater before lights out. Every prank, every sabotage was meant to break the fragile thread of her endurance. But what they didn't realize was that every act of cruelty became a new layer of armor. She learned to run blistered and thirsty, to sleep wet and cold, to push when others would curse. With each challenge, she hardened. And with each day, more names disappeared from the roster. The bell rang again and again, and men far bigger, louder, and supposedly stronger than her disappeared from the compound. Yet she remained. Some began to notice. A quiet respect stirred, though few admitted it aloud. Even those who still mocked her lowered their voices when she passed, their laughter sounding forced. They had thrown everything at her, tricks, traps, and weight meant to crush her, and still she was there. One evening, during chow, an instructor walked past her table. He didn't pause, didn't speak, but his eyes flicked toward her with something different from the usual cold steel. It wasn't approval, not yet, but it was recognition. He had seen walls built around candidates before. Most were crushed. A rare few found cracks to slip through, but almost none grew strong enough to push the walls down entirely. And that was what she was becoming. The wall of resistance hadn't broken her. It had forged her. Every shove, every sneer, every extra pound on her shoulders had taught her something vital. Survival wasn't just about strength, it was about adaptation, patience, and willpower sharper than any blade. The men still doubted her, still plotted, still whispered. But deep inside, the first seeds of fear had begun to take root. Because if she could endure this long under their sabotage, what would happen when she stopped merely surviving and started fighting back? For now, she kept her silence. But silence, as they would learn soon, was the most dangerous sound of all. Pain. It became the one constant in her world. From the moment the instructors yanked them out of their bunks at 4 a.m., blowing whistles sharp enough to pierce the skull, until the moment exhaustion finally dragged them into a restless sleep, pain was her companion. It lived in her muscles, in her lungs, in the raw patches of skin rubbed open by sand and seawater. It was a teacher more brutal than any instructor, and she learned quickly that there was no point resisting it. The others cursed it. Some tried to fight it with bravado, puffing their chests and barking louder than the sergeants. Others collapsed into silence, broken by the weight of it. But she treated pain differently. She didn't fight it, didn't deny it. She let it settle into her bones like an old friend. During drown proofing, when their ankles were bound and their wrists tied before being thrown into the pool, she sank beneath the water with her heart hammering. Panic surged for a moment, primal and suffocating. She forced herself to stillness, to trust the lessons drilled into her. Float, don't thrash. Breathe when you can. Endure when you must. The others gasped and flailed. Some had to be dragged out. She surfaced calm, her eyes unflinching. The instructors noticed. Later, on the beach, they were ordered into the surf. The Pacific was merciless, waves slamming into their bodies, the cold slicing into nerves like knives. The men beside her shivered violently, some screaming curses into the night. She locked her arms with theirs, lips pressed tight, and let the water numb her skin. She was freezing, her teeth chattered, but she refused to give the ocean the satisfaction of seeing her break. The instructors' voices boomed. If you don't want to be here, the bell is waiting. Warm showers, hot coffee, and a ride home. Several eyes darted toward the bell. Some of the toughest-looking men she had seen that first day stumbled out of the surf, their resolve washed away by the tide. The clang of the bell echoed across the beach again and again, until only a fraction of them remained. She was one of them. Pain was no longer her enemy. It was her sharpening stone. By the second week, her body looked different. Her shoulders grew harder, her frame wiry but unyielding. Blisters tore open on her feet, blood soaking into her socks, but she learned to run anyway. Every step was fire, but fire became fuel. Her hands split open on the ropes of the obstacle course, yet she climbed higher, faster. Her voice grew hoarse from constant shouting, but her silence and pain became its own roar. Some began to see it. One night, after a brutal day of log carries, flutter kicks in the surf, and endless push-ups in the sand, one of the men someone who had mocked her early on sat across from her in the chow hall. He didn't speak at first, just studied her with tired eyes. Finally, he muttered, "I don't know how you're still standing." She didn't answer. She just kept eating, one slow bite at a time. Because how could she explain? How could she put into words the years of preparation, the mental scars that had already carved her into steel before she ever set foot here? These men thought the training was the beginning of pain. For her, it was just a continuation. But others still resented her. During a night march with packs heavy enough to grind spines into dust, one candidate deliberately bumped her off balance. The stumble nearly cost her footing on the uneven ground. She steadied herself, her jaw tightening, but she said nothing. To confront him would have been to admit weakness. Instead, she absorbed the blow and kept moving. Hours later, when they staggered back into camp, he collapsed from exhaustion. She didn't. That was the difference. The instructors began to notice the pattern. They didn't praise her. Praise was rare here, but they stopped watching her with the same suspicion. Their shouts lingered less on her name. Their corrections grew fewer. She wasn't a distraction anymore. She was proving herself, one miserable, painful hour at a time. But pain was relentless. Her body screamed during rock portage, when teams had to lift and carry massive inflatable boats over their heads, running along the beach with the Pacific winds tearing at their skin. The boat weighed hundreds of pounds, pressing down on their necks and shoulders until vertebrae felt like they would snap. Men dropped out, collapsing under the crushing weight. She gritted her teeth and bore it, her body trembling but her spirit immovable. During Murph workouts, push-ups, pull-ups, squats, miles of running in between, her lungs felt like they would burst. Every rep carved a deeper ache into her bones. Yet she refused to let the pain dictate her limits. Each rep became a question, and each time she answered, "I am still here." She began to understand something most of the others didn't. Pain wasn't just physical. It was mental. It whispered lies, telling you that you couldn't go on, that stopping would be easier, that the bell was your salvation. She learned to silence it, to listen to the deeper voice inside her that said, "Keep moving. Just one more step, one more breath, one more rep." And step by step, she advanced while others fell away. Her body carried scars, now red raw patches where the sand had cut her, bruises black and purple along her ribs, scratches from crawling through mud and wire. But she wore them like medals, each one proof that she had faced pain and chosen not to yield. The wall her peers had tried to build around her still stood, but she had learned to walk through it. Their whispers grew less frequent, their eyes less mocking. Some still hated her presence, but more began to respect it. Because they couldn't deny the truth anymore. She was still there, still standing, still enduring, while many of them were not. Pain had not broken her. It had become her teacher, her weapon, and her greatest ally. And though she didn't yet know it, the lessons she learned in those grueling days would soon prepare her for something far darker than cold seas and endless drills, because when her peers finally moved from whispers to action, she would need every ounce of strength pain had given her. The sun dipped low over the horizon, staining the Pacific in streaks of gold and crimson. The candidates were already exhausted from the day's punishment mile after mile of running in soft sand, push-ups until shoulders screamed, and a boat portage drill that left bruises etched into their necks. Most were ready to collapse into their bunks. But the instructors weren't finished. "Gear up," an instructor barked. "Night infiltration exercise. You've got 10 minutes. Groans filled the air, but no one dared to protest. Within minutes, the candidates assembled in full combat gear helmets, rifles, heavy rucksacks strapped tight against aching shoulders. The rules were simple. Teams had to move silently through the mock training grounds, infiltrate a designated structure, and secure it before the clock ran out. Instructors lurked everywhere, waiting to punish mistakes. For her, this was the moment she lived for. Unlike the endless running and muscle-breaking drills, this was strategy, stealth, and skill. It wasn't about size or brute strength. It was about precision, awareness, and grit. She welcomed it. But not everyone shared her focus. As they moved into the dark, through sand and scrub, she noticed the sideways glances again. A few of her peers hung back, whispering among themselves. She'd learned to recognize that something was brewing. They had been testing her for weeks, but now their patience had run out. Tonight, they weren't just going to weigh her down or trip her up. Tonight, they wanted to make a point. The exercise began. The squad split into 2 fire teams, weaving through the mock village plywood walls and cinder block buildings designed to mimic urban combat zones. Moonlight cut across sharp angles, shadows hiding unseen threats. Every sound seemed louder in the still night, the crunch of gravel, the creak of gear straps, the faint whisper of boots against sand. She took her position near the rear, scanning corners, her senses sharp. But as her team rounded an alley, she felt it, a deliberate slowing of pace, a subtle shift in movement. The men she marched with weren't watching the objective. They were watching her. They funneled her down a side path, away from the main group. At first, it seemed accidental and natural split in the formation. But when she glanced back, the exit was already blocked. 3 of them stood behind her, forming a wall of muscle and silence. Ahead, 2 more slipped into the shadows, waiting. The trap had sprung. For a heartbeat, the night went still. The only sound was her own breathing, measured and calm. She tightened her grip on her rifle, not to fire, but to remind herself of the discipline drilled into her veins. This wasn't combat. Not yet. But the look in their eyes told her this wasn't just training either. One of them smirked, stepping forward. End of the line. She said nothing. Another chuckled, shifting the strap of his pack. You've been making us look bad. Time someone showed you what happens when you get in the way. The words weren't shouted, they were whispered, low and venomous, meant only for her ears. The instructors were too far to notice, and even if they had, they might not have stepped in. This was part of the crucible. SEAL training wasn't just about physical limits, it was about survival, even among your own. Her pulse quickened, but her face betrayed nothing. If they thought fear would show in her eyes, they were wrong. Come on, another sneered. You don't belong here. Ring the bell tomorrow. Save yourself the pain. She straightened, shoulders squared under the weight of her gear. Her voice was calm, steady. If you're done talking, let's finish the exercise. The smirk turned into a snarl. Wrong answer. They moved. The first lunged, aiming to shove her into the dirt. But she was ready. She sidestepped, pivoting on instinct, and his own momentum carried him into the wall. Before the others could react, she dropped her pack, freeing her body for movement. The second swung an arm, a clumsy attempt at intimidation. She deflected with a sharp twist, using his weight against him. He stumbled, caught off balance. The third hesitated, surprised at her speed, but then charged anyway. This time, she didn't dodge. She dropped low, swept his legs out from under him, and rolled clear as he hit the ground with a grunt. Sand sprayed across the alley, the muffled thud of impact swallowed by the night. Her breaths came faster now, her heart pounding. Not from fear, but from control. Training had become instinct. Instinct had become reaction. Every move drilled into her bones over weeks of pain and exhaustion now flowed like water. But she knew this wasn't over. The 2 ahead stepped out of the shadows, faces hard. One carried his rifle like a club, swinging it low. The other cracked his knuckles, eyes blazing. Looks like she thinks she's one of us, the first growled. She won't be for long, the other spat. They advanced together. She steadied herself. Every nerve screamed at her to fight, to strike fast and end it. But she couldn't cross that line. This was still training, still the Navy's grounds. To unleash everything she had would mean crossing into a place she couldn't return from. She needed precision, control. They lunged. She moved. The rifle swung, she ducked, her hand snapping up to catch the weapon and shove it aside. With her other hand, she drove her palm into his chest, forcing him back. The second threw a punch, but she slipped sideways, the fist grazing her shoulder. Her elbow shot back in response, striking his ribs with enough force to stagger him. The alley erupted into chaos grunts, the scuffle of boots, the scrape of gear. She flowed between them, never stopping, never hesitating. Every lesson hand-to-hand drills, close-quarters tactics, survival reflexes played out in real time. She wasn't the outsider anymore. She was the storm they had unleashed. When it ended, they were sprawled in the sand, groaning, stunned. None were seriously hurt. She had held back, even when instinct begged her not to. But their pride lay shattered in the dirt. She stood over them, breathing hard, her expression calm. She didn't gloat, didn't smile, didn't say a word. She simply picked up her pack, slung it over her shoulders, and walked out of the alley. When she rejoined the squad at the objective, no one asked why she was late. The instructors were waiting, arms crossed, eyes unreadable. Whether they had seen or suspected, she couldn't tell. But one of them gave her a single, almost imperceptible nod. Not approval acknowledgement. The trap had been set to break her. Instead, it had revealed her. That night, whispers filled the barracks again. But they were different this time. Not mocking. Not sneering. They were quieter, edged with something new. Fear. Because the men who had tried to corner her now knew the truth. She wasn't just surviving the program. She was mastering it. And from that night forward, every step she took through the training grounds carried the weight of silence. The silence of men who had seen the strength they couldn't crush. The trap in the alley had changed everything. Until that night, she had survived the training by endurance alone. She had carried extra weight without complaint, run on blistered feet without slowing, and shouldered the silent hostility of her peers without retaliation. Her strength had been quiet resistance, not retaliation. But now, something in the balance had shifted. They had tried to corner her. They had tried to crush her. And instead, they had revealed the truth. She wasn't just enduring. She was learning. The next morning, reveille blared through the compound, pulling the candidates from their bunks. The day began like every other, with push-ups in the sand, endless sprints, and the instructors' voices thundering through the dawn air. But for her, the world looked different. She didn't just see obstacles anymore. She saw opportunities. Every drill, every exercise, every test, they weren't punishments. They were lessons. And now, she began to draw on them with purpose. During the obstacle course, when others scrambled blindly, she moved with strategy. The rope climbs became not just about strength, but about leverage. Her body coiled like a spring to conserve energy. The high walls weren't just barriers, but chances to practice momentum, timing her jumps with precision. Where others wasted motion, she flowed like water, conserving every ounce of strength. Some noticed. A few muttered about her luck. Others gritted their teeth, refusing to admit she was simply better prepared. The instructors noticed too. Their shouts still cut through the air, but they lingered less on her name. She was no longer the weakest link in their eyes. She was becoming something sharper. But the resentment of her peers didn't fade. If anything, it grew sharper. One afternoon, during a live navigation exercise, the squad was ordered to split and rendezvous at a checkpoint deep in the scrub-covered hills. Each candidate was given a map and compass, expected to find their way through uneven terrain under the ticking clock. She was fast, her movements efficient, her route calculated. But as she crested a ridge, she realized she wasn't alone. Two of them had followed her. Not by accident. They fell into step, cutting her off at every turn, slowing her pace. They lost their bearings on purpose, dragging her into dead ends. It was sabotage disguised as incompetence, and if she protested, the instructors would mark her as a complainer. This time she didn't resist. She adapted. She played along, letting them believe they were frustrating her. All the while, she adjusted her course with subtle corrections, an angle here, a landmark there. By the time they realized what she was doing, she had already guided them straight to the checkpoint. The instructors logged her time as one of the fastest. The two who tried to derail her glared, their pride stung. But she didn't look back. She had drawn on her arsenal, not just physical skills, but patience, awareness, and the ability to see through the fog of deception. The next test came during water drills. The Pacific was merciless that day, waves pounding the candidates as they practiced small boat handling. Inflatable crafts overturned, dumping men into the freezing surf. The shouts of instructors mixed with the roar of the ocean, demanding order from chaos. She moved with purpose, barking commands that cut through the storm. When her team's boat capsized, she didn't panic. She flipped it with the precision she'd drilled 100 times, dragging her teammates back aboard, forcing them into rhythm with her strokes. The cold cut deep, but she ignored it, focusing only on timing, on keeping the craft moving in unison. When they hit the beach, their boat was one of the first ashore. The instructors nodded, scribbling notes on their clipboards. No praise, not yet but recognition. Her peers, however, were less forgiving. That night, the barracks buzzed with whispers. Some called her reckless, others lucky. But beneath their words lay an unspoken truth. She was outpacing them. And that truth stung worse than any insult. The hostility reached a breaking point during hand-to-hand combat drills. The candidates were paired off, ordered to spar under the watchful eyes of instructors. For weeks, the men had joked about the day she would be paired with one of them, convinced she'd be embarrassed. When the time came, they shoved forward a volunteer, a broad-shouldered candidate with a grin that promised cruelty. The instructors barked, "Begin." He charged fast, aiming to overpower her with brute strength. But she had trained for this. She pivoted, using his momentum to slip behind him. Her arms snaked around his neck, not choking, just controlling. He struggled, grunted, tried to throw her off, but she stayed calm, steady, applying pressure until he stumbled forward. With a sharp twist, she released him, sending him sprawling in the dirt. The other candidates erupted in laughter, not at her, but at him. The grin on his face vanished, replaced by a flush of shame. She stood tall, calm, not a smile on her lips. She didn't gloat. She didn't need to. The instructor's eyes lingered on her a moment longer. They had seen it. Precision, control, restraint. She hadn't fought with anger. She had fought with mastery. And that was the difference. Every lesson she had endured, every freezing wave, every sabotage, every whispered insult had become part of her arsenal. She wasn't just drawing on strength. She was drawing on patience, discipline, and adaptability. The wall of resistance her peers had built was still there, but now she was dismantling it piece by piece, not by shouting, not by force, but by proving, again and again, that she was stronger, faster, sharper. That night, as the barracks settled into uneasy silence, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling. She thought of the instructors, their hard eyes. She thought of the ocean, its relentless cold. She thought of the men who had tried to corner her, to crush her, to break her. And she thought of her father's words, echoing in her mind. Strength isn't about shouting louder than others. It's about standing when everyone else has fallen. She wasn't standing by accident. She was standing because every lesson of pain, every act of sabotage, every drop of doubt had become her arsenal. And soon, they would learn the full weight of what that arsenal could unleash. The barracks had grown quieter since the night of the alley. The whispers hadn't stopped, but they carried a new edge. Fear, unease. They still didn't accept her, but they no longer underestimated her. And yet, the hostility lingered. By the 6th week of training, the instructors introduced the dreaded Hell Night simulation, a brutal, no-sleep endurance drill designed to break spirits. Candidates were forced through obstacle runs, ocean plunges, and endless tactical scenarios, all while drenched, freezing, and hallucinating from exhaustion. It was a nightmare carved into tradition. And for her, it was about to become the stage where everything shifted. The exercise began at dusk. The candidates were divided into squads, ordered to navigate the training grounds under simulated combat conditions. Booby traps, ambushes, and staged hostiles lurked in every shadow. The instructors patrolled silently, watching, judging. Her squad moved as a unit, rifles clutched tight, eyes scanning the dark. But she could feel it again, the subtle drifting of her teammates, boxing her in, funneling her toward another setup. They hadn't given up. They wanted one more chance to break her. This time, she didn't resist being pulled into their trap. She welcomed it. The squad entered a clearing surrounded by tall scrub and skeletal trees. Moonlight filtered weakly through the haze, casting jagged shadows across the dirt. The air carried the sharp tang of salt and smoke. Instructors had lit controlled fires nearby to simulate chaos. Perimeter. The squad leader barked. They fanned out. But when she stepped into position, 3 shadows shifted around her. Then 2 more cut her off. She recognized them immediately, the same ones from the alley, now more desperate, more reckless. The squad leader looked away, pretending not to notice. This was no accident. It was sanctioned in its own twisted way. The circle tightened. "Well, look who thinks she belongs here," one sneered, voice hoarse with fatigue. "Let's end this game," another muttered, eyes narrowed. One way or another. Her fingers brushed the stock of her rifle. She didn't raise it. She didn't need to. Instead, she straightened, meeting their eyes one by one. Her voice was calm, steady, even in the suffocating silence. "You want to test me? Fine, but remember you asked for this." They lunged. The first came straight on, a clumsy charge fueled by anger more than skill. She sidestepped smoothly, hooking his arm and using his momentum to send him sprawling. Before he could recover, she pressed the heel of her boot to his chest, not crushing, just holding, a warning. Then she moved on. The second swung wide, aiming a heavy blow. She ducked low, twisting under the arc, and struck his ribs with the butt of her rifle. The impact knocked the air from his lungs, sending him staggering back, gasping. 2 more advanced together, trying to overwhelm her with numbers. But they'd forgotten the first rule of close-quarters combat: control the angles. She pivoted sharply, forcing them into each other's path. One stumbled into the other, and she seized the opening, dropping low, sweeping their legs and sending both into the dirt in a tangled heap. By now, the clearing echoed with grunts, curses, the sound of boots scuffing against sand. But she moved like a shadow among them, calm, precise, efficient. Every motion was a lesson she had endured, every strike tempered by discipline. She wasn't fighting with rage. She was fighting with mastery. The last one hesitated. He had mocked her the loudest in weeks past, his voice dripping with contempt. Now that voice faltered. His eyes darted to the men groaning on the ground, then back to her. "You don't belong here," he spat, though his voice shook. She took a step forward. Then another. Her rifle hung at her side, not raised. Her presence alone pushed him back. "Then why?" she asked softly. "Are you the one on the ground?" He froze. For the first time, he had no answer. The clearing fell silent. The 5 who had cornered her lay scattered, breathing hard, pride shattered. She stood above them, not gloating, not smiling, just steady, unbroken, a silhouette carved against the moonlit haze. The instructors stepped from the shadows. They had been watching. For a long moment, they said nothing. Their expressions revealed little stone-faced, unreadable. But one of them gave the faintest nod. Not approval, not yet, but acknowledgement. She had turned the trap into a stage. And in doing so, she had turned the tables completely. The rest of the squad, who had stood by and watched, shifted uneasily. The silence pressed down on them heavier than the weight of their packs. They could no longer whisper that she didn't belong. They could no longer pretend she was weak. They had seen too much. That night, when the candidates stumbled back to the barracks, drenched and bone-weary, no one met her eyes. The hostility hadn't disappeared. It wouldn't vanish overnight. But it had been silenced, if only for a while. She sat on her bunk, peeling off her soaked boots, her muscles aching with exhaustion. Around her, the others collapsed, some muttering, some groaning, all broken by the night's torment. But not her. She had endured. She had fought. She had won. For the first time since stepping into the program, she felt the shift deep in her bones. She wasn't just surviving their tests. She was redefining them. The men who had tried to corner her now carried the weight of their own defeat. The instructors who had doubted her now carried the knowledge of her strength. And she herself carried something greater than all of it proof. Proof that no matter the trap, no matter the hostility, no matter the odds, she could stand her ground and rise above. The tables had turned, and there was no turning them back. The clearing still lingered in their minds long after the exercise had ended. The men who had tried to corner her nursed their bruises in silence, avoiding her gaze at every turn. The instructors had not spoken a word about it during debrief, but their eyes had betrayed something new: acknowledgement, perhaps even approval. For her, that was enough. The real change didn't come in a sudden burst of applause or recognition. It came in something subtler, sharper, and more profound: silence. The next morning, the candidates shuffled to formation, battered and exhausted from Hell Night. Their boots dragged, uniforms soaked with sweat and salt. But when she stepped into line, the usual jeers were absent. No muttered insults, no mocking laughter. Just silence. It wasn't friendly silence. It wasn't warm. But it was weighty, a silence that spoke louder than any taunt. They no longer dared to test her with words. The instructors barked orders, and the squad moved into drills. The obstacle course loomed ahead, sand still damp with morning fog. One by one, the candidates hurled themselves against the barriers. Groans and curses filled the air. Yet when she approached the rope climb, no one tried to block her. No one tried to cut her line or add weight to her pack. She scaled it quickly, movements fluid and efficient. At the top, she paused for half a heartbeat, scanning the field below. Dozens of eyes glanced up at her, and then away. Not in dismissal, in avoidance. The silence followed her through every station. That night, in the chow hall, it deepened. Meals were usually loud affairs banter, complaints, arguments over trivial things. But when she entered, tray in hand, conversations faltered. She sat alone at the end of the table, the usual snickers absent. The men who had once laughed at her presence now studied their food with unusual focus. At first, she wondered if the silence was just another form of isolation, a cold shoulder meant to freeze her out. But then she caught the sideways glances, the stiffness in their shoulders, the way conversations restarted only after she had finished eating. It wasn't exclusion. It was caution. They had seen what she was capable of, and now they feared it. The instructors noticed too. During tactical drills, they paired her with different candidates, forcing the men to work alongside her. Some stiffened at first, their pride wounded, but the instructors demanded compliance. Slowly, reluctantly, they adapted. What shocked them most wasn't her ferocity, but her control. She never gloated, never humiliated those who had once mocked her. She offered commands with calm precision, corrected mistakes without venom. She treated them not as enemies, but as teammates. This unsettled them more than her strength. Because dominance was easy to hate, but respect was harder to resist. One evening, during a live fire simulation, the squad was tasked with clearing a mock compound. Darkness pressed in on all sides, the crack of blanks echoing through plywood walls. Chaos reigned. The candidate behind her hesitated at a doorway, frozen under the weight of decision. She didn't shove him aside. Instead, she leaned close, voice low and steady. Left corner first. And sweep. You've got this. The man moved, following her words, clearing the room cleanly. He didn't thank her, no one would in this place. But when they regrouped outside, his eyes flicked toward her with something new. Not friendship. Not yet. But acknowledgement. A silence was cracking. In the barracks, the change was even more palpable. Where once her bunk had been a target for pranks, boots hidden, years sabotaged, it was now untouched. No one dared mess with her space. Her bed was neatly made, her gear squared away, her boots polished to a shine. And though no one admitted it, the room seemed to orbit differently around her. The ones who had mocked her now avoided her entirely. The ones who had ignored her now watched her with cautious curiosity. Even the strongest candidates, the natural leaders, kept their distance. She had become something strange in their world, not an equal, not yet a leader, but a presence they couldn't dismiss. The silence had become her shield. But silence carried a weight of its own. One night, as she lay awake in the dim barracks, listening to the steady breathing of exhausted men, she wondered what the silence really meant. Was it respect or isolation? Fear or acceptance? She thought of her father again, his words etched deep in her memory. Strength isn't just about standing. It's about what others do when you stand. Now she understood. Her presence had forced a choice. They could continue to resist, clinging to their pride, or they could adapt. The silence was the pause between those decisions. And in that pause, she had room to grow. The instructors pushed harder as the weeks dragged on. Longer swims in icy waters, heavier packs on endless marshes, tactical scenarios that stretched into sleepless nights. Candidates dropped, ringing the brass bell that signaled defeat. But she remained. Each time another man quit, the silence deepened. Because every departure reminded the others she was still there, still standing. And with every passing day, the weight of that truth grew heavier. The turning point came during a brutal night march. The squad trekked for miles through mud and scrub, weighed down by gear, exhaustion gnawing at their bones. One candidate stumbled, falling hard into the muck. His pack pinned him, and for a moment he lay there, too tired to rise. The others kept moving, eyes forward. No one stopped. No one dared lose pace. But she did. She dropped beside him, hauling the pack off his shoulders, gripping his arm. On your feet. We finish this together. The man stared at her, stunned. Then, with her help, he rose. They rejoined the squad, mud-streaked but unbroken. No one spoke of it later, but the silence that night was different. Not fearful, not hostile. Something else entirely. Something like respect. The aftermath of her battles wasn't marked by celebration or applause. It was marked by the absence of resistance, the absence of mockery. The silence had once been a weapon against her. Now it was the ground on which she stood. And in that silence, she was no longer the outsider. She was the standard. By the final week of training, the camp had changed. The air was heavier, quieter, the tension no longer solely focused on survival. The candidates had learned painfully, that she was not just enduring. She was mastering, adapting, leading, and above all, commanding respect without ever asking for it. The instructors had taken note. Their eyes followed her movements during every drill, every obstacle, every simulation. Not with disbelief, not with doubt, but the measured interest reserved for candidates who had gone beyond the ordinary. She had survived every challenge, outlasted every test, and turned every sabotage into an advantage. And now, it was time to redefine the standard. The final exercise was a full-scale simulation, an urban assault scenario across the training compound. Teams were tasked with securing multiple objectives, clearing buildings, coordinating movements, and adapting to hostile environments under strict time constraints. The stakes were high. The instructors had warned that any mistake could be the difference between success and failure in this exercise meant repeating grueling drills in the dead of night. Her team looked tense. Even the men who had once mocked her now moved with deliberate caution around her. They had seen the precision, the skill, the calm under pressure, and they feared being the weak link. She stepped forward, surveying the compound, noting the placement of mock obstacles, the likely routes of ambush, and the positioning of her teammates. This was no longer about survival. This was about mastery. "Stick to your zones," she instructed quietly, her voice calm but firm. "Cover each other. Communicate. Watch my signals." Her words were met with a mix of surprise and hesitation. But the team obeyed. They had learned through observation and experience that following her guidance increased their chances of success, and perhaps unknowingly, of survival. The simulation began. They moved through alleys, breached doors, and cleared rooms with precise coordination. Every step she had taken in training, the endless push-ups in the sand, the long-distance runs with blistered feet, the sabotage from her peers, the night infiltrations, now manifested as instinctive skill. Her movements were calculated, her timing flawless. At one point, 2 team members encountered a simulated enemy ambush. They froze, uncertainty flashing in their eyes. She didn't hesitate. She sprinted forward, dragging one behind a wall, giving precise hand signals to the other. With minimal movement, she neutralized the threat, guided her teammates, and pressed on. The instructor's notes were meticulous. The men who had tried to break her watched, silent, as she demonstrated what it meant to be a SEAL, not through brute force, but through calculated mastery, composure, and leadership. Hours passed. The team advanced through building after building, checkpoint after checkpoint. She anticipated obstacles, adapted to changing conditions, and guided her team with authority that was invisible yet unmistakable. No one dared question her. When the final objective was reached, the team stood together, sweat-soaked, exhausted, and exhilarated. They had completed the exercise faster than any other squad that day. And in the eyes of the instructors, she was the undeniable force behind it. Her peers, who had mocked, sabotaged, and doubted her, now looked at her with something heavier than acknowledgement. There was a grudging respect, yes, but also a recognition of transformation. She had not merely survived the system. She had elevated it. The camp's atmosphere had shifted permanently. That night, in the barracks, the usual post-drill chatter was subdued. Men spoke in quiet tones, careful of their words, careful of her presence. But there was no longer tension, no underlying hostility. She moved among them, organizing gear, tending to minor injuries, helping with tasks without condescension. Her influence was subtle, yet unmistakable. Leadership in this place wasn't about rank or brute force. It was about trust, discipline, and mastery. And she embodied it fully. One of the men who had mocked her from the beginning approached quietly. His eyes were cautious, but his voice held sincerity. You led us through today. Faster than anyone else. We underestimated you. She nodded once, simply. We succeed together. That's the standard. No anger, no gloating. Just clarity. In the final morning of the program, the candidates lined up for graduation inspection. The instructors moved among them, scrutinizing every uniform, every posture, every bearing. When they reached her, they paused. One of the senior instructors, his face unreadable for weeks, finally spoke. You've done more than endure. You've redefined the standard for this program. Not through defiance, not through brute strength, but through discipline, precision, and leadership. You belong here fully and without question. Her peers watched as she stood silently, absorbing the words not as praise, but as confirmation of what they had already seen. The silence that had followed her for weeks had transformed. No longer a weapon or a threat, it was now a presence that commanded focus, respect, and acknowledgement. The ceremony concluded, but the impact lingered. She didn't just finish the program, she altered its rhythm, its culture, its perception of possibility. The men who had tried to undermine her now carried a lesson etched into memory. Strength is more than size, resilience more than stubbornness, and leadership more than authority. Even the instructors, masters of assessment and discipline, had witnessed it. In her final moments at the training ground, she walked past the familiar obstacles, the beaches, the scrublands, and the alleys that had once been traps. Each step was deliberate, steady, carrying the weight of trials, endurance, and triumph. She didn't look back not out of arrogance, but because she had already redefined the path ahead. She was no longer just the outsider who had survived. She was the standard against which all others would be measured. Years later, candidates would tell the story of the woman who endured sabotage, overcame hostility, and mastered every trial of Navy SEAL training. They would speak of her calm under pressure, her discipline, and her ability to draw lessons from pain itself. Her legacy wasn't a tale of brute strength. It was a story of patience, precision, leadership, and transformation. And in the training compound, long after her departure, her presence lingered in silence, a quiet, enduring testament to what it truly meant to belong. No one ever underestimated her again.